The copper salt scent reached Vorath before the Dorvathi delegation did. That was the wrong detail. She noted it the way she noted everything, quietly, without moving her face, and filed it under things that would matter later. Copper salt was involuntary, a Dorvathi stress marker, buried in the biochemistry, impossible to suppress. The hegemony's high arbiter had not yet crossed the threshold of Orindal Accord Hall, and already his body was telling a different story than his prepared remarks. Vorath stood at the edge of the reception floor in dress uniform she had worn to 42 functions before this one. The fabric held the particular stiffness of something maintained rather than worn. Her left hand hung at her side. The thumb of her right hand rested against the raised edge of the chemical scar on her left wrist, old tissue, slightly cooler than the skin around it, and she was not tapping yet. That came later. When the tapping started, her staff had learned to count. 43, she thought. This was function 43. She had stopped counting the promises several ceremonies ago. Above her, Vorath's storm bands moved through the observation rings in colors that had no names in any language she spoke. The gas giant filled the lower third of every window, amber bleeding into rust, bleeding into something almost violet at the pressure boundary, and the station hung above it the way a coin hangs above a drain, suspended in orbital mechanics that 12 species had agreed 9 centuries ago was neutral territory. Orindal Accord Hall, built jointly, maintained jointly. The only structure in the galaxy where the Dorvathi hegemony and the human reserve corridor met on equal footing. The chairs at the treaty table were the same size. Vorath had first noticed that at 23. On a school visit she remembered less clearly than she remembered the chairs. She had looked at them through the glass of the sealed museum alcove, original table, original chairs. The document that ended the War of Lorath preserved in atmospheric suspension between them. And she had felt something she could not name. Not offense, not pride, something closer to a warning she hadn't been given the context to read. It took 30 years of diplomatic work to understand what it was. She did not look at the alcove as she crossed the reception floor. She did not need to. The hall itself was older than it looked. 12 species had contributed materials. 12 design philosophies had fought to a draw. And the result was a space that felt simultaneously too large and too deliberate, vaulted ceilings in the Kethori tradition, pressure regulated to accommodate the Vesselkin observers in their suits along the far wall, floor-to-ceiling glass panels framing Vorath, storms on 3 sides. The air recyclers ran underneath everything, a low mechanical breath, and over that, the smell of the stone the Dorvathi imported for ceremonial occasions. Something mineral, something between ozone and the floor of a very old building, and the copper salt underneath both, growing stronger. Vorath moved her thumb off the scar. Admiral Tomas Bane appeared at her left shoulder in the way he always did, as if he had simply decided to be there and the universe had obliged. He was 71 years old. His dress uniform was pressed to a standard she had never been able to match, and she had long since stopped trying. He carried nothing in his pockets at formal functions, said it was because he didn't like the weight. She had always thought it was something else, that he wanted to arrive at these things unburdened, carrying only what he intended to say. "They're early," he said, "by 4 minutes. That's new." She didn't answer. He knew what it meant as well as she did. Delegations that arrived early were delegations that wanted to establish something before the ceremony required them to be civil. Bane straightened his cuffs. It was a habit, not vanity, just a small adjustment he made when he was thinking. She had seen him do it in 37 separate negotiation rooms across 20 years of joint assignment, and it always preceded the same thing, a decision about what he was willing to say and what he was willing to absorb. "Kroth," she said, not a question. "High Arbiter Selvin Kroth." Bane's voice was even. "I've read the file." "So have I." A pause. Below the station, Vorath's violet pressure band shifted toward something darker. "He ratified the Marin Expanse clearance," Bane said. "Both of them." Bane said nothing for a moment. The Marin Expanse had been a civilization, present tense once. 2 pre-spaceflight species, nascent technology, no military capacity. The hegemony had classified them as territorial interference with a shipping lane. The clearance had taken 11 days. No one had objected at the Hegemony Council because no one had thought it worth the friction. "Well," Bane said finally. He straightened his cuffs again, which was not like him. "Function 43. Function 43, she agreed. Selvin Croth walked through the main doors as if he had designed them to accommodate him. He was 2.3 meters tall, which was average for a Dorvathi male of his rank, and he wore the formal robes of his office in deep umber and gold, which meant he was treating this as a state occasion rather than a renewal ceremony. The distinction was deliberate. Vorath catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, a data point, file. His bioluminescent ridge ran from the crown of his skull to the nape of his neck. At rest, it was pale. At agitation, it brightened to something close to white. Standing in the doorway of Orindal Accord Hall, with the copper salt already in the air, his ridge was a faint luminous line. Not at rest. He had 8 fingers on each hand, 3 ceremonial brands on his left wrist, each marking a prior conquest adjudication, the Dorvathi equivalent of a service medal, and he moved with the particular slowness of something that had never been required to hurry. His eyes crossed the assembled human delegation the way a person's eyes cross furniture they are planning to rearrange. Not contempt, exactly. Something more fundamental than contempt. Contempt requires the awareness of risk. This was its absence. He had never, Vorath understood, been required to model what he did not consider relevant. What she authorized in that facility below Callisto, I'll tell you now, it took 11 hours just to read the list. Stay close. The ceremony began with the reading of the Armistice Accords. This was tradition, 900 years of tradition. A Dorvathi official read the original text in the Hegemony's formal tongue, then a human official read it in the standard Accord language, and then both parties sat at the original table and signed the renewal documents while cameras broadcast to every inhabited world in the Hegemony's sphere. Vorath stood at attention during the reading. Her mind did not drift. She had trained that capacity out of herself decades ago, but she was aware, in the way she was always aware during these functions, of the particular quality of what was not being said. The Accords, in formal language, were a treaty between equal parties, humanity and the Hegemony, as co-signatories, agreeing to maintain their respective territories, respect navigational boundaries, pursue disputes through the Accord mediation process. Equal parties. The chairs were the same size. The Hegemony controlled 73% of charted space. Humanity occupied a designated reserve corridor, tolerated, monitored, and periodically described in Hegemony diplomatic cables as peacefully settled. The cables were not classified. Humanity read them, had always read them, had read the one, 214 years ago, in which a junior Hegemony intelligence analyst described humanity's colonial expansion patterns as culturally eccentric but non-threatening, and had filed the observation without escalation. That cable was one of 214. All 214 had been filed under cultural eccentricity. All 214 had been closed without escalation. The Hegemony's intelligence apparatus was thorough and systematic, and had spent 9 centuries logging anomalies in human mining outputs, shipping volumes, and energy consumption patterns that did not match humanity's declared industrial capacity. 214 times, someone had written the same note. 214 times, no one had pulled the thread. Croth departed from his prepared remarks in the 47th minute. Vorath knew the prepared remarks. She had received them through diplomatic channels 3 weeks prior, as was protocol. She had read them twice, made 3 annotations, and set them aside. They were what she had expected: formal, ceremonial, the usual language about shared history and mutual commitment to galactic stability. Nothing inflammatory, nothing notable. What Croth said instead was this: the Hegemony renews this accord with genuine appreciation for the role that humanity has chosen to play, the quiet, settled partner, content within its corridor, committed to peace above all other considerations. He paused. His ridge brightened fractionally. In an age when many species press against their boundaries, there is something admirable in a civilization that understands its place and inhabits it gracefully. The room did not make a sound. Every human in the hall understood what had just been said. Several of the non-human observers understood it too. The Kethori in their pressure suits along the far wall had gone very still, their vibration patterns on the hull surfaces dropping to nothing. The Murath Collective's 3 representatives, 12-limbed and processing in parallel threads, had shifted their attention to the human delegation simultaneously. Croth was still smiling. Tomas Bain straightened his cuffs. Then he said, quietly enough that anyone beyond the first 3 rows might have missed it. The hegemony has always been generous in its interpretation of our choices. We have found it easier not to correct them. Croth's ridge brightened to something closer to white. He opened his mouth. The 3 Reclamation Synod operatives had been embedded in the Dorvathi staff delegation for 6 weeks. Their credentials identified them as protocol analysts. Their actual function had been discovered by human intelligence services 4 days prior. The decision about what to do with that information had been made at a level above Vorath's current authority. She had been informed of the decision. She had not been told she would agree with it. She didn't. The operatives moved at the same moment, because they had been trained to one motion, 3 points in the room, timed to the acoustic window when the recycler cycle peaked, and the ambient noise would compress the initial sound into something that might, for a fraction of a second, be mistaken for a mechanical failure. Admiral Tomas Bain was dead before the echo of the first discharge cleared the hall. He did not fall dramatically. He simply stopped being upright, the way a machine stops when power is removed, and the cameras, every camera, broadcasting live to every inhabited world in the galaxy, caught all of it. His pockets were empty. He had not wanted to carry anything he didn't mean to say. Vorath was on the floor before she had decided to move. That was the training. Not thought, not decision. The body going where it had been taught to go while the mind caught up. Her sidearm was in her hand. She was behind an overturned section of the ceremonial table, and her communicator was already at her mouth, and she was transmitting before she had finished processing the fact that Bain was dead. Protocol Ardent, this is Vorath. Authenticate Loreth 9. Energy bolts crossed the hall above her. Screaming, multiple species, multiple registers. The acoustics of Orindal's vaulted ceiling turning the sound into something that came from everywhere at once. She returned fire twice, moved left, returned fire again. Then she waited. 4 seconds. It was the longest 4 seconds of her career. Long enough to think the system had been compromised. Long enough to think 52 years of preparation had led to this room, and the authentication was going to fail, and the answer would be silence. Then, from 1,000 different transmitters across human space, simultaneously, the confirmation tone. Authenticated, all systems releasing. On a colony station called Farath 7, 17 children were in the middle of a mathematics lesson when their teacher stopped speaking, opened a cabinet that had been locked for as long as the school had existed, and took out a different set of books. The children did not look surprised. They had always known the cabinet was there. They had been told, since they were old enough to be told anything, that one day it would open. On 43 cargo routes running through the reserve corridor's outer transit lanes, ships that had been operating at listed maximum speed reduced velocity for exactly 6 seconds. Then they accelerated, past their listed maximum, past what their filed specifications said was possible. The discrepancy between their actual engine capacity and their declared engine capacity had been logged by hegemony transit monitors 214 times over the course of 9 centuries, filed under cultural eccentricity. On Callisto, in the subsurface level designated on hegemony intelligence maps as a mining operations center, a door opened that had not opened in 300 years. The hegemony's intelligence service had logged 214 separate reports, suggesting anomalies in human mining and shipping patterns. All 214 had been filed under cultural eccentricity and closed without escalation. This was their final opportunity to wonder what they had been filing. Vorath was evacuated from Orindal through a service corridor she had never used because she had never needed to. The escort team was 4 people, none of whom she recognized, all of whom moved with the particular economy of individuals who had rehearsed this specific route. She did not ask questions. She had, over the past 4 seconds of her life, transitioned from diplomat to Supreme Commander, and Supreme Commanders did not ask their escorts where they were going. She knew where she was going. She had known for 52 years. The transport that lifted from Orindal's secondary bay carried 12 people, including Vorath. It did not go to Geneva. Geneva was where they would expect her to go, the UN Crisis Command, the Emergency Council chambers, the holographic screens with all the colonial leaders. Geneva was the visible command structure, the one the hegemony's intelligence services had spent 9 centuries monitoring. The transport went to Callisto. The approach to Callisto's subsurface facility took 22 minutes from orbital insertion. Vorath spent 19 of them reading the authentication inventory, a partial list, automatically transmitted the moment Lorath 9 was verified, of what the releasing systems actually contained. She had seen versions of this list before, in summary form, in sealed briefings that she had attended as a condition of her rank. Summaries did not prepare you for the actual list. She was on page 4 when she closed the document. The door that opened at her palm scan was not like the other doors in the facility. It was heavier. The seal broke with the sound of pressurized air that had been contained for 3 centuries, a specific exhalation, cold and slightly sweet, that she did not have a reference for. Old atmosphere, the kind that predated her parents, predated everything except the decision that had been made in the first years after the armistice of Lorath. Director Yara Ashen was waiting on the other side. She was 44 years old, slight in the way of someone who spent most of her time underground, and her eyes carried the particular brightness of a person who had been waiting a very long time to be useful. She had run the ossuary tier for 11 years. Before her, her mother. Before her mother, her grandmother. A woman who had been present at the armistice signing, who had looked at the equal chairs and understood immediately, who had spent the remaining 40 years of her life making sure that understanding was preserved. 3 generations of a family that had kept a secret from everyone, except the people who needed to know. The inventory takes 11 hours to read, Ashen said. No greeting. Do you want me to start? Vorath looked at the corridor behind Ashen. It extended further than any mining operation should. The lighting was standard white, even, but the scale was wrong. The scale had always been wrong. That was the point. Give me the headline, Vorath said. Ashen's expression did something that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting their entire life to be asked a specific question, and had rehearsed the answer so many times it no longer felt like a rehearsal. We are 900 years ahead of them, she said, across every category. Vorath stopped her at hour 3. She had heard enough. She authorized everything. The inventory, which she would read in full 3 days later, included the following: nanomachine interdiction swarms, each unit smaller than a human blood cell, capable of reproducing using the materials of whatever they were dismantling. Quantum synchronized fleet coordination systems, no communication lag, no lightspeed delay, every human warship in the corridor operating as a single organism regardless of distance. Phase-penetrating kinetic ordnance, designed to pass through standard energy shielding as if it were not there, because against this specific category of projectile, it was not. Selective biological agents keyed to Dorvathy cellular markers, designed to affect military-aged males in active service while leaving civilian populations untouched. Gravity wave emitters. The hegemony had spent 9 centuries analyzing what humanity had built. They had never asked what humanity had buried. The first engagement happened at Keshin Point, which the hegemony's navigational charts designated as the primary transit corridor of the human reserve, the artery through which humanity's trade moved, the chokepoint that any sensible military force would want to control early. Hegemony Commander Threven Osel brought 400 warships to Keshin Point 31 hours after the assassination. His orders were to secure the corridor, demonstrate force, and await diplomatic resolution. He expected 30 human vessels. His censor officer reported 80. Osel dismissed this as a miscalculation, a censor artifact, or a redeployment of civilian shipping that had been misclassified. He ordered standard engagement protocol, form line, advance, issue surrender terms. The human ships did not form a line. They moved the way a school of fish moves. which is to say they moved like one thing with 80 bodies. And the thing they were doing was not retreating. They accelerated directly into the hegemony formation at angles that conventional targeting systems had not been designed to track, because conventional targeting systems operated on the assumption that ships had reaction times limited by the speed of electronic decision-making. These did not. These were neural interface craft. The distinction matters. A neural interface pilot does not issue commands to a ship. The pilot's nervous system is the ship's nervous system. Thought and motion are the same event. By the time Osel's weapons officers had computed a targeting solution, the human ships were no longer where the targeting solution pointed. Osel lost 60 ships in the first 8 minutes. His own targeting computers, somewhere in the 4th minute, began reclassifying 12 of his remaining vessels as hostile. He did not know why. He would not know why for another 6 days. When the post-battle analysis determined that human electronic warfare systems had introduced a cascading identification error into the hegemony's fleet network, a viral intrusion that had been delivered not through any broadcast signal, but through the electromagnetic wake of the human ships themselves as they passed through the formation. His fleet retreated. Human losses, none. Threven Osel filed his battle report that evening. It contained in the summary section 3 words. They were ready. Hegemony High Command reviewed the report the following morning. They struck those 3 words and replaced them with unexpected tactical variants. The official record would later note that this was their second mistake. The first had been firing. The rehook came not as a signal, but as an absence. 6 of Osel's surviving ships made it back to hegemony space. His debrief was conducted the same day they arrived and classified within the hour. The classification level placed it above the Hegemony High Council's standard clearance. 3 of the council members who requested access were denied. They appealed. The appeals were pending when the war ended. Nobody at Hegemony High Command wanted to be the person who put Osel's 3 words into a document that future historians would read. What Vorath knew, reading the battle data in the ossuary tier's primary analysis room, was simpler. Keshin Point had answered the question nobody in the hegemony had thought to ask. The question was not whether humanity could fight. The question was whether humanity had been fighting all along, in a way nobody had classified as combat. She pulled up the intelligence anomaly log, 214 entries. Shipping volumes, mining outputs, energy consumption, personnel movement patterns. All flagged, all filed, all closed. 900 years of questions that had got the same wrong answer. She tapped the scar on her left wrist. Once, then she closed the file and told Ashen to prepare the Ghost Battalion status board. The Ghost Battalion operatives were already inside the building when the shift change happened. That was the part Vorath had not been told in advance. Not the infiltration itself, which she had known about for 4 days, but the timing. The 2 operatives, listed in Dorvathi employment records as contract logistics analysts attached to the capital's Municipal Infrastructure Bureau, had been inside the hegemony's primary military coordination center on Vel Dorvat Prime for 6 months before Protocol Ardent was authenticated. 6 months of filing accurate, unremarkable reports. 6 months of learning which corridor led to which server cluster, which guard rotation had the 11-minute gap, which atmospheric processor vent ran adjacent to the data core's secondary housing. They did not destroy anything. Destruction leaves evidence of what was there. Destruction tells you someone wanted what you had badly enough to deny it to you. The operatives copied everything, every hegemony fleet position, every supply cache coordinate, every contingency plan filed in the past 40 years, and transferred it to Vorath's command architecture in 6 hours through a channel the hegemony's monitoring systems classified as routine maintenance traffic. Then they left. The building did not know they had been there. The hegemony's post-war investigation would later determine that the infiltration had begun before Protocol Ardent was authenticated, before Bane was killed, before, technically, there was a war to conduct espionage in. Vorath was asked about the timeline once, at a Concordat accountability session 14 months after the surrender. She declined to clarify it. The status board in the Ossuary Tier's secondary operations room showed 47 Ghost Battalion cells across hegemony space. Each cell was a number and a status indicator. Green meant active and uncompromised. Vorath looked at the board for approximately 4 seconds. Every indicator was green. "How long have they been in place?" she asked. Ashen checked a secondary display. Oldest cell 31 years, youngest 8 months. Vorath said nothing for a moment. 31 years was before her current command appointment. Before, technically, the strategic review that had authorized the expansion of Ghost Battalion operations beyond the reserve corridor's boundary. Who authorized the 31-year cell? Admiral Vorath. She died in office 12 years ago. Vorath had attended the memorial. She had given a brief address about Vorath's contributions to diplomatic liaison work. She had not known, or rather, and this was the part she would think about later, in the hours between decisions when thinking was all that was left, she had known in the way that you know things that are too large to hold as individual facts. She had known the shape of it, the outline, the weight of what was being maintained, generation after generation, in facilities like this one. But the specific 31-year cell on Vel Dorvat Prime, the names of the 2 people currently inside a building 40 light minutes away, copying files in the dark, that she had not known. She tapped her scar twice. "Authorize full data transfer," she said, "and tell me when the fleet release is ready." The fleet release took 4 hours to execute because executing it properly required sequencing. Not because the ships were not ready, but because 9 centuries of hidden deployment had distributed them across positions that needed to be vacated in the correct order to avoid creating sensor signatures that would tell the hegemony, before Vorath was ready for them to know, exactly how many vessels were moving and from where. The official human military record listed 300 warships. The number that actually moved was 31,000. The hegemony's border monitoring systems registered the first deviations as instrument errors. This was a reasonable conclusion. Instrument errors happened. The second wave of deviations was logged as a software anomaly and flagged for maintenance review. The third wave exceeded the threshold at which the monitoring system was designed to escalate to human, or rather, Dorvathi, review, and a duty officer on Vel Dorvat Prime received an alert that she classified as a cascade failure in the monitoring network itself. By the time anyone understood what the readings actually meant, the interdiction platforms were already active. They had been built into asteroid formations along every viable approach vector to human space, disguised as mineral extraction infrastructure, maintained by automated systems for 9 centuries. Each platform was unmanned. Each carried weapons systems that did not appear on any chart the hegemony possessed, because the charts had been provided by humanity during the Joint Navigational Survey of 1891 IC, and humanity had filed accurate data about everything except the platforms. Of the 22,000 Dorvathi warships that mobilized in the 72 hours following the assassination, 6 reached human space. The rest were interdicted, disabled, or absorbed by systems that did not appear on any chart the hegemony possessed. Some were disabled cleanly, engines neutralized, crew unharmed, ships drifting. Others encountered the nanomachine swarms, which were less clean but faster. A small number simply stopped transmitting, and the post-war investigation was unable to determine exactly what had happened to them, and Vorath, when asked, declined to speculate. 6 ships. Out of 22,000, Ensign Cale Wren was 24 years old on the day of his first combat deployment, which was also the day he learned that everything he had been told his entire life about what readiness meant had been, in a technical sense, an understatement. He had grown up on a colony station in the outer reserve corridor, the kind of place where the walls were close and the recycled air tasted faintly of whatever the previous shift had been cooking, and where children were told, clearly and without drama, that a day might come when their training would matter. Not threatened with it, not frightened by it, told, the way you tell someone a fact that is true and necessary and should be held without panic. His grandmother had fought in a border conflict he was not supposed to know the details of. She had told him stories anyway, because she was 87 and had decided that the classification level of her own memories was no longer her problem. The stories were not heroic. They were careful. They were about the gap between what you trained for and what the training actually asked of you when it came due. He had not understood what she meant until the neural link went active. The interface was standard issue, a filament array bonded to the occipital and temporal regions, processing delay under 3 milliseconds. What it did when active in combat configuration was fold the fighter's sensor suite into his peripheral vision, the way a second set of eyes folds into your field of view. Not a display, not information on a screen. Presence. The 11 Dorvathi gunships at Keshan Point's secondary engagement zone were not targets on a readout. They were presences he was aware of the way he was aware of his own hands. He did not feel like a weapon. He felt like someone doing a job that needed doing, which was, he would later decide, exactly what his grandmother had been trying to tell him. 11 gunships. His weapons were not energy-based. Energy weapons left traces, left heat signatures, left the specific electromagnetic debris that conventional after-action analysis could read. These were quantum-entangled kinetic charges, which meant they materialized inside their targets rather than traveling to them, and the only thing a Dorvathi sensor suite registered was the result. The result was 11 gunships that were there and then were not. He returned to base. He wrote his report. Before he wrote his report, he sat in the debriefing room for 20 minutes and he did not speak, and no one asked him to. His grandmother had cried when she told him her stories. He finally understood why. Elder Moon Selat arrived at the Ossuary Tier facility on the 6th day of what the hegemony was calling, in its official communications, an unprecedented security incident requiring measured response. He was 340 years old. He had been present, as a junior military observer, at the signing of the armistice of Loreth 9 centuries prior. He had been one of 12 Dorvathi officials who voted against the armistice terms as insufficiently comprehensive, not because he wanted the war to continue, but because he understood, having fought in it, that the terms did not reflect what had actually happened. He had been overruled. The official history had been written without his objection. His objection was in the record if you knew where to look. Almost nobody had looked. He came to Vorath through a channel that should not have existed, a diplomatic frequency that had been maintained in theoretical readiness for exactly this kind of approach, the kind where someone from the other side needed to talk to someone on this side without their own government knowing they were talking. Vorath authorized the transport personally. He was smaller than she expected, which was not a reasonable thing to expect. She had read his file. She knew his dimensions. But there was something about the way he moved that compressed him. He had the bearing of someone who had been carrying a correct opinion for 9 centuries without anyone asking for it, and the weight of that had bent him slightly forward, as if he were perpetually about to say something he had already said too many times. He looked at her for a long moment in the side room off the Ossuary Tier's main corridor. The copper salt scent of Dorvathi stress was in the air, quieter than Croth's had been, older, more controlled, but present. "I told them," he said, "before Croth gave the order, before the Synod operatives were embedded. I told the High Council that you were not what you appeared to be." "What did they say?" His expression was the expression of someone recalling a thing they had expected to recall for a very long time. "They said I was sentimental, that I was old enough to be frightened of things that no longer existed." A pause. "They were correct about my age." Vorath said nothing. "I fought in the First War," Selat said. "I know what the end of it actually looked like because I was there, and I read the unedited reports before your family's successors and mine agreed to file the edited ones. You did not stop because you were exhausted." He looked at her steadily. "You stopped because you chose to." "Yes. I have been trying to explain that distinction to my government for 900 years. He looked past her, at the Ossuary Tier corridor extending into its improbable distance. "May I see the inventory?" She led him to the display room. He stood in front of the panels for a long time without speaking. His ridge, which she had not noticed was faintly luminous, went dark, not from agitation, from something else. The opposite, maybe. The particular stillness of a thing that has been proven right so completely that being right no longer feels like a victory. "You were always going to win," he said finally. "I knew that in the first war. I tried to put it in the record." He turned toward her. "What do you need from me?" The broadcast went out on the 31st day. Vorath had not planned to make it on the 31st day specifically. The timing was not strategic. It was simply the day when the analysis from the Vel-Dorvat Prime data transfer was complete enough to display accurately. And accuracy was the only thing she wanted behind her when she spoke. The Ossuary Tier's primary broadcast chamber was not designed to look impressive. It was a functional room, white walls, standard lighting, a transmission array that could reach every receiver in charted space simultaneously. What made it look the way it looked in the recording that every species in the galaxy would watch for the next century was the inventory display behind her. Panel after panel of classified system coordinates, weapons schematics, fleet positions, production figure, 900 years of accumulated capability, rendered visible for the first time. She did not stand at a podium. She adjusted her collar. She was not wearing her rank insignia, had removed it before entering the room, set it on the table outside, picked up nothing else. Authority that needs displaying is already lost. Then she looked into the transmission array and began. In the Dorvathi High Council's war room on Vel-Dorvat Prime, 12 officials watched the broadcast on a screen that occupied the entirety of the chamber's north wall. High Arbiter Selvin Kroth sat at the center of the table. His bioluminescent ridge was at full brightness. Had been, his staff would later note in their personal logs, for 6 days without interruption, which was the physiological equivalent of a Dorvathi screaming continuously for a week. He watched Vorath on the screen. He watched the panels behind her. He was a systematic person. He had spent 40 years in administrative and military governance. He understood inventories. He began counting. The room was silent for a very long time. Then a junior analyst at the end of the table said, in a voice that was almost too quiet to carry, "How long have they had that?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. That was the answer. Kroth's hands, 8-fingered and bearing 3 brands of conquest on the left wrist, rested flat on the table. He did not move them. He was looking at a figure on one of the panels. A production rate, a specific number representing the annual output of a specific class of weapons system. And he was doing the arithmetic of what 900 years of that production rate implied, and the arithmetic was not resolving into anything he could work with. Outside, in the orbital space above Vel-Dorvat Prime, the hegemony had positioned 400 warships as a defensive screen. They were the finest vessels in the hegemony's fleet. They had been placed there because someone had calculated that 400 ships represented a credible deterrent. Kroth looked at the panel. He looked at the 400 ships in his defensive screen. He understood, for the first time in his career, the precise definition of the word irrelevant. Across the galaxy, the broadcast played simultaneously. On the Murath Collective's primary habitat station, 47 representatives processed Vorath's words in parallel threads. The Collective's consensus mechanism, a distributed deliberation that typically required between 3 and 7 days to reach binding agreement, completed in 14 seconds, a speed no external observer had ever recorded. The message they transmitted to Vorath's diplomatic frequency arrived before the broadcast had finished playing. "We are interested in the new order. Advise." On 17 neutral worlds, species that had maintained careful relations with both the hegemony and humanity for 9 centuries, trading partners and observers, and the quiet infrastructure of a galactic order they had not built but had learned to navigate, diplomatic officers watched the inventory panels and began composing inquiries to Vorath's office before Vorath had finished speaking. Not declarations of allegiance, not offers of assistance. Careful, calibrated inquiries. The kind that left room to claim later that they had simply been asking questions. In a pressurized habitat corridor on Orindel Station, 3 Kethori Vesselkin in their suits watched the broadcast on a screen mounted to the hull and communicated in vibration patterns too subtle for any external monitor to read. The patterns said, roughly translated, "We knew. We have always supplied both sides without either knowing. This outcome was the only one we planned for." And in his secure observation chamber on Vel Dorvet Prime, High Arbiter Kroth called for Elder Moon Selet. Selet was not there. Selet had been on Callisto for 5 days. The junior analyst who had asked the unanswerable question did not go home that evening. He remained at his station after the rest of the war room staff had dispersed, and he pulled up a blank document, and he began writing. Not a report. He had no authority to file a report at the classification level this required. Not a recommendation. He had no standing to recommend anything to the people above him. He wrote something between a memo and a private reckoning, addressed to no one, detailing in precise administrative language what the inventory panels implied about the current military situation, and what, in his assessment, the only rational response to that situation was. He did not tell Kroth. He saved the document under a file name that would have been, to any oversight algorithm scanning for sensitive content, completely unremarkable. He went home. He came back the next morning and kept writing. The 30 days passed. The hegemony issued 3 statements during this period. The first described the assassination as a tragedy caused by rogue elements and expressed the hegemony's commitment to accountability through established legal channels. The second announced the formation of an internal review committee to examine the circumstances of the Reclamation Synod's activities. The third offered to discuss, through diplomatic mediation, the question of what form accountability might appropriately take, given the complexity of the political situation. Vorath did not respond to any of them. On the 31st day, she advanced 2 fleet groups into Dorvathi interior space. They did not fire. They positioned themselves across the primary supply route between Vel Dorvet Prime and its 3 largest tributary worlds and stopped moving. No weapons active. No communications. Just the presence of ships that were exactly where the hegemony's shipping lanes needed to be, and the absence of any indication that those ships intended to move. 11 days later, the tributary worlds stopped receiving resupply shipments. The shipping companies that normally operated the route had, independently, rerouted to avoid the human fleet groups. No one had ordered them to. They had simply looked at the situation and made a business calculation. 14 days after the fleet groups took position, the tributary worlds began internal rationing. 21 days in, 3 species within the hegemony's interior declared independence. Not from the hegemony specifically, from the current governance structure, pending resolution of the crisis. The language was careful. It said nothing about humanity. It said a great deal about not wanting to be on the wrong side of what was clearly coming. Kroth summoned his council on the 25th day. 3 of the 12 seats were empty. The species that held those seats had, in the previous week, opened diplomatic dialogue with Vorath's office. They had not publicly announced this. They had simply stopped returning Kroth's communications and started returning Vorath's. Kroth looked at the 9 remaining members. His ridge was still bright. It had not dimmed in 19 days. "They are not attacking us," he said. "They have the capacity. The inventory, we have all seen the inventory. They have the capacity and they are not using it." He looked around the table. "Why are they not attacking us?" The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Then a council member, not the junior analyst, a different official, more senior, who had spent 30 years in logistics before taking her council seat, said carefully, "They don't need to." Another silence. "They are waiting," she continued, "for us to do it for them." Kroth looked at her. She did not look away. A younger aide at the back of the chamber, who had been standing quietly for the entire session and who had no speaking role in council meetings, said very quietly, "I think they are letting us fall apart on our own, sir." Kroth turned toward him. The aide, whose name was Veth, who was 26 years old, whose personal log from this period would be published by the Post-War Historical Commission and read by more people than any document he would ever produce in an official capacity, met his gaze without flinching. Kroth said nothing. He did not fire the aide. Something about the aide's face, the absolute, undefended accuracy of it, had stopped him. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at his hands. Elder Moon Selat testified before Vorath's command council on the 38th day. His testimony ran to 200 pages. The post-war historical commission published it in full. Most species read the summary. The section that was broadcast galaxy-wide was 4 sentences. We were winning in the First War. We had more ships, more worlds, more resources. We were winning until the humans stopped caring about winning and started caring about finishing. That is when we begged. That is what your council hid from you for 900 years. The broadcast of those 4 sentences reached Croth's private channel 9 minutes after transmission. He watched them once. He did not watch them again. He did not need to. He had spent 9 centuries in a government built on a history that presented the armistice of Lorath as a negotiated settlement between exhausted equals. And listening to Selat, who had been there, who had the unedited reports, who had tried to file the objection and been overruled, dismantled the foundation of everything Croth had understood himself to represent. He was not a conqueror who had been stopped. He was the inheritor of a civilization that had begged and been given mercy it did not earn, and then spent 9 centuries mistaking the mercy for a draw. His resignation was filed on the 40th day. The Reclamation Synod leadership was surrendered to human custody on the 41st day by a junior military commander who did not wait for authorization from anyone above him. He opened the door to their detention facility, informed them they were being transferred, and said, to no one in particular, this was not worth it. The trial was held at Orindal Accord Hall. Before the proceedings began, Bain's name was added to the station's memorial register, not with ceremony, not with an announced addition, but quietly, in the hour before the hall opened, by a station administrator who had known him for 20 years and who was not asked to do it by anyone. Vorath attended every session. She sat in the observer section, not the prosecution section. The case was being argued by a 7-species tribunal with jurisdiction established under emergency accord provisions, and her role was evidentiary, not prosecutorial. She confirmed the identification of documents. She verified chain of custody. She answered direct questions with direct answers and did not offer additional information beyond what was asked. She wore her rank insignia to the trial. This was the appropriate context for authority that needed displaying. The verdict was unanimous across all 7 jurisdictions. The sentence was permanent incarceration in human medical custody, with access to Dorvathi medical specialists and cultural accommodations, and with human longevity treatments as standard care. The 12 Reclamation Synod leaders would live significantly longer than the natural Dorvathi lifespan, potentially centuries longer. Some observers, reading the sentence, described it as merciful. The 12 leaders understood immediately that it was not. The Concordat framework took 11 days to negotiate, which was fast by any galactic standard and deliberate by Vorath's. She had arrived at the negotiation table with a document, not a draft, a document. It was not presented as a starting position. It was presented as the terms. Autonomy over internal governance, cultural practice, political organization, no wars of aggression, no military buildup beyond self-defense parameters, to be verified by human inspection on a schedule determined by humanity. Human peacekeeping fleet maintaining presence in all major transit corridors. Enforcement authority residing with human command. Several species objected. Vorath listened to every objection fully. She did not interrupt. She did not make notes because she did not need to. When each objection concluded, she said the same thing with minor adjustments for context. These are the terms. We are not negotiating the architecture. We are offering you the opportunity to participate in it voluntarily. That offer has a duration. The Murath Collective signed first. Their consensus had been reached 14 seconds into her broadcast, 5 weeks prior, and they had been waiting ever since. The Kethori Vesselkin signed second, with 2 addenda regarding trade route protections that Vorath accepted without objection. Because the Kethori had supplied both sides for 9 centuries without either knowing, and that kind of neutrality was, she had decided, worth formally protecting. Every remaining species signed within 11 days. The Concordat was not, strictly speaking, voluntary, but it was not, strictly speaking, coerced. It occupied a space between those categories that Vorath suspected would be argued about by political theorists for the next several centuries, and she was fine with that. Arguments were better than the alternative. She went to the treaty chamber on the last evening, before the Concordat took formal effect. The alcove was where it had always been, off the main corridor of Orindal Accord Hall, behind the glass that had been installed by the third generation of curators. The original table, the 2 chairs, the document in atmospheric suspension, 900 years of careful preservation, and the chairs were still the same size, and she stood looking at them for a long time. She thought about Bane, who had adjusted his cuffs before answering Croth, who had carried nothing in his pockets because he did not like the weight, who had spent 43 years going to these functions and believing, genuinely, not as a performance, that the next one might be the one where the hegemony chose something different. He had been right about what humanity could be. He had been wrong about the timeline. She ordered the chamber sealed, not preserved, sealed. No tour, no school visits, no diplomatic delegations brought to look at the chairs as a symbol of shared history. The chairs were not a symbol of shared history. They were a record of a specific misunderstanding, and misunderstandings should be remembered, not celebrated. One placard, placed inside before the door was locked. Equal chairs, unequal preparation, remember the difference. The door closed. The atmospheric seal engaged. Vorath stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked toward the dock. 6 weeks after the surrender, Ensign Cale Wren, promoted, technically, but still thinking of himself as an ensign, because the rank had not yet settled into his sense of himself, lifted off from Orindal Station's secondary bay on the first official Concordat patrol. He had been assigned Sector 7, which covered the transit lanes between Orindal and the Keshen Point debris field. It was not a glamorous assignment. It was, in fact, a quiet sector, the kind where nothing would happen, where the point was not to respond to anything but to be present in a way that made response unnecessary. His neural link came active the moment he cleared the bay doors. The system folded into his peripheral vision. Every ship in range, every frequency active, every gravitational variance that might indicate something his instruments should look at more closely. Not threats, not targets, a map. The difference between those categories was, he had decided, the most important thing he had learned in the past 6 weeks. He was not looking for war. He was looking for the thing that comes before war, the anomaly, the pattern, the 214th entry that someone had filed under cultural eccentricity and almost forgotten. The thing that looks like nothing until you understand what nothing is supposed to look like. Below him, Vorath's storm bands moved through their cycle in colors that had no names in any language he spoke. Amber bleeding into rust, rust bleeding into something almost violet at the pressure boundary, and then below that, colors that the atmospheric analysis equipment classified as spectral ranges rather than shades, because shades required a word. He keyed his transmitter. Concordat 1 departing Orindal, Sector 7, all quiet. A pause. Keeping it that way, the patrol began. On Earth, in a garden that had been tended every spring for 6 years by a rotating crew of volunteers who had never been formally asked to do it. Tomatoes grew in neat rows in soil that someone had prepared carefully, in ground that was worth growing things in, under a sky that was not on fire.